The United Nations was established in 1945 with the ambitious goals of maintaining international peace and security, promoting social progress, fostering international cooperation, and upholding human rights. While the organization has achieved notable successes, such as its role in decolonization, global health initiatives, and humanitarian assistance, it has often fallen short of its original objectives. Various structural, political, and operational challenges have hindered its ability to fully realize its founding vision. We will discuss major factors contributing to these shortcomings, with expanded explanations and examples. Veto power. One of the most significant structural weaknesses of the UN is the veto power granted to the 5 permanent members of the Security Council: China, France, Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States. The veto system was intended to ensure consensus among major powers, but has frequently resulted in deadlocks, preventing decisive action. Example: the Syrian civil war. Since the conflict began in 2011, the Security Council has been paralyzed by vetoes, particularly from Russia and China. Russia has repeatedly blocked resolutions aimed at sanctioning the Assad regime or authorizing stronger international interventions, citing sovereignty concerns. This deadlock has contributed to the prolongation of the war, resulting in hundreds of thousands of deaths and a massive refugee crisis. Bureaucratic inefficiencies and corruption. The UN's large bureaucracy has often been criticized for inefficiency, waste, and corruption, undermining trust in its operations. Complex procedures and a lack of accountability mechanisms exacerbate these issues. The Oil for Food program was established in 1995 to provide humanitarian aid to Iraqi civilians affected by sanctions. The program became one of the UN's most infamous scandals. Investigations revealed that billions of dollars were siphoned off through bribes and kickbacks involving companies, governments, and UN officials. This scandal severely damaged the organization's reputation for integrity and accountability. Administrative inefficiencies have also plagued UN peacekeeping missions, leading to delays and inadequate resources. For instance, peacekeepers in South Sudan have been criticized for failing to protect civilians despite their mandate. The UN's inability to prevent mass atrocities is a glaring failure of its peace and security mandate. Despite its role in early warning systems and conflict resolution, the organization has often failed to act swiftly and decisively, like in Rwanda and Serbia. In Rwanda, the UN peacekeeping force known as UNAMIR was underfunded and constrained by a limited mandate that prohibited proactive measures. Despite warnings from commanders on the ground, the international community failed to act, leading to the genocide of approximately 800,000 Tutsi and moderate Hutu. During the Bosnian War, the UN declared Srebrenica a safe area. However, when Serbian forces overran the town, UN peacekeepers were unable to prevent the massacre of over 8,000 Bosniak men and boys. This failure highlighted the limitations of UN peacekeeping in protecting vulnerable populations. Influence of major powers. The UN's neutrality has been compromised by the influence of major powers, particularly during the Cold War and in subsequent decades. The organization's actions have often been shaped by the geopolitical interests of its most powerful members. Cold War dynamics. During the Cold War, the UN often became a battleground for ideological conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. This rivalry frequently paralyzed the Security Council, limiting the UN's ability to address conflicts in a balanced manner. The US decision to invade Iraq without explicit UN Security Council authorization demonstrated the organization's inability to constrain unilateral actions by powerful states. Despite widespread international opposition, the UN could do little to prevent the invasion, significantly undermining its authority. Challenges in UN peacekeeping operations. UN peacekeeping missions, though well-intentioned, have faced significant challenges, including underfunding, limited mandates, and allegations of misconduct by peacekeepers, as in Congo and in Central Africa. Democratic Republic of the Congo, DRC. The UN mission in the DRC, known as MONUSCO, established in 1999, is one of the longest-running peacekeeping operations. Despite substantial financial and personnel investments, the mission has struggled to stabilize the region, where armed groups continue to perpetrate violence. Criticism has been directed at the mission's inability to protect civilians effectively and bring lasting peace. Allegations of abuse. Numerous allegations of sexual exploitation and abuse by UN peacekeepers have tarnished the organization's reputation. Reports from Haiti, the Central African Republic, and other missions reveal a pattern of misconduct, undermining trust in the UN's ability to uphold its principles. Inequality among member states. The structure of the UN disproportionately empowers a few nations while marginalizing others. This inequity often leads to frustration among smaller or less powerful member states, which feel excluded from meaningful decision-making processes. Many countries in the Global South have called for reforms to make the Security Council more representative. For instance, Africa lacks permanent representation despite being a significant focus of UN peacekeeping efforts and development aid. This imbalance fosters resentment and perceptions of bias. Over time, various countries have expressed dissatisfaction with the UN, occasionally suggesting withdrawal. However, no member nation has officially exited the organization, highlighting the complexities and repercussions of such an action. One of the notable occurrences is when Indonesia declared its withdrawal in opposition to Malaysia's inclusion as a non-permanent member of the Security Council. This decision reflected broader regional tensions, including disagreements over Malaysia's formation. However, the UN never formally acknowledged the withdrawal, and Indonesia rejoined in 1966 after a leadership change. In 2016, Philippines President Duterte threatened to withdraw from the UN after criticism of his administration's anti-drug campaign, which involved thousands of extrajudicial killings. Despite his strong language, the Philippines remained a UN member, demonstrating the gap between rhetoric and action. In 2017, the American Sovereignty Restoration Act sought to end U.S. membership in the UN, citing concerns that the organization undermined national sovereignty. While the bill received some support from fringe groups, it failed to gain traction in Congress. The UN continues to grapple with significant challenges that impede its ability to fulfill its mandate, underscoring the need for structural reforms and renewed commitment to its founding principles. Historically, similar proposals have encountered significant opposition due to concerns about diplomatic repercussions, the deep integration of the United States within the UN system, and recognition of the UN's essential role in addressing global challenges such as peacekeeping, humanitarian crises, and climate change. Within the U.S. foreign policy community, there is a general consensus that engagement with the UN, despite its flaws, serves both national and international interests. In this video, we explore the growing efforts by Brics nations and countries from the Global South to advocate for substantial reforms within the United Nations, or, in some cases, to consider withdrawing from the organization entirely. We analyze the motivations behind these movements, the challenges these nations face, and the potential consequences for the future of global governance. Countries in the Global South, particularly those within the BRICS group, have intensified their demands for comprehensive UN restructuring. Collectively, Brics nations account for over 40% of the world's population and approximately 1/4 of global GDP, a share that continues to grow. However, the distribution of power within the UN, especially in the Security Council, remains rooted in mid-20th century assumptions. The 5 permanent members with veto rights, the United States, United Kingdom, France, Russia, and China, continue to dominate the Council's agenda, influencing decisions on peacekeeping, sanctions, and global security. Despite 54 African countries making up nearly 28% of the UN's membership, none hold a permanent seat on the Security Council. This glaring imbalance highlights the need for reform to better represent the realities of the modern world. How did the UN form? The United Nations was established in 1945 after World War II, aiming to succeed where the League of Nations had failed. 51 founding members signed the UN Charter in San Francisco, committing to prevent future conflicts, promote human rights, and encourage economic and social progress. Central to the UN's structure was the Security Council, whose 5 permanent members, the United States, United Kingdom, Soviet Union, now Russia, France, and China, reflected the wartime Allied powers. Critics argue that this structure embedded an outdated power dynamic, contradicting the UN's principle of sovereign equality. From its inception, the UN was constrained by Cold War tensions. Peacekeeping missions were sporadic and often obstructed by Security Council vetoes. Specialized agencies such as the WHO, UNESCO, and UNICEF addressed global challenges, earning praise for their humanitarian efforts, but also facing criticism for serving the geopolitical or economic agendas of major donors. Cold War dynamics from the 1950s to 1989. The rise of newly independent African and Asian states in the mid-20th century enhanced the geographic diversity of the General Assembly. However, the Security Council structure remained static, excluding these nations from key security decisions. Peacekeeping missions, such as those in the Congo during the 1960s, were hampered by inadequate mandates and funding. Major conflicts, such as Soviet interventions in Eastern Europe and US-backed coups in Latin America, highlighted the Security Council's paralysis when permanent members' interests clashed. Meanwhile, decolonization progressed. The UN became a platform for emerging powers to challenge Western dominance. However, increased membership had only a limited impact on the organization's core mechanisms, as the veto power of the 5 permanent members continued to dictate outcomes on critical issues. Specialized agencies expanded their influence, yet some observers argued that they primarily reinforced Western policy frameworks by linking development to liberal economic model. With the end of the Cold War, hopes rose that the UN could overcome superpower stalemates. The 1990s saw a surge in peacekeeping missions, including in Cambodia, Somalia, and the Balkans, reflecting optimism about collective security. However, these missions often ended in failure. In Somalia in 1993, the Black Hawk Down incident exposed flaws in planning and insufficient international coordination. In Rwanda in 1994, a weak and underfunded UN deployment failed to prevent the genocide of nearly 800,000 people. In Bosnia in 1995, UN peacekeepers were unable to stop atrocities like the Srebrenica massacre, further underscoring structural weaknesses. Calls for Security Council reform grew stronger, focusing on adding permanent seats for emerging regional powers such as India, Brazil, Germany, and Japan, and improving African representation. Veto-wielding members opposed any reduction of their influence. Simultaneously, major powers sometimes bypassed the UN entirely, most notably the US-led invasion of Iraq in 2003, casting doubt on the body's ability to restrain unilateral actions. Despite expanded multidimensional peacekeeping mandates covering everything from elections to human rights, current missions still operate with tight budgets, limited troop commitments, and the threat of vetoes. Accusations of sexual abuse and exploitation by some peacekeepers have further damaged the UN's reputation. Beyond peacekeeping, many observers have noted a Western bias in the UN's approach to global governance and human rights. Criticism and scrutiny often target non-Western states, while similar abuses by Western nations or their allies receive less attention. For example, Russia's restrictions on LGBTQ+ rights and China's policies against minority groups in Xinjiang and Tibet face strong condemnation from Western media, diplomatic channels, and international organizations. Reports document mass detentions, forced labor, and cultural suppression. In contrast, systemic racism, racial profiling, and excessive policing in Western countries, such as those highlighted by the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States, rarely face equivalent international sanctions or pressure. The UN has launched ambitious frameworks such as the Millennium Development Goals and the Sustainable Development Goals. While these programs highlight shared priorities, they are criticized for being top-down, underfunded, and lacking sufficient accountability. Additionally, the UN's ties to the IMF and World Bank, institutions dominated by Western powers, fuel claims that global economic policies are driven by neoliberal agendas rather than local needs. Climate talks under the UNFCCC, including the Paris Agreement, reveal ongoing tensions. Emerging economies seek more equitable burden sharing and financial support to address historical emissions by industrialized nations. Brics nations and Global South analysts emphasize the need for a more balanced approach to international governance. They argue that systemic inequalities within the UN, particularly in representation and accountability, must be addressed to ensure a fairer global order. Without meaningful reform, the UN risks losing credibility as a truly universal organization. Indigenous populations in the United States, Canada, and Australia have long endured biases, economic barriers, and cultural erosion, exemplified by Canada's history of residential schools and the poor living conditions in many Native American communities. While these issues are included in official reports, external reactions and media coverage are generally far less than what is directed at non-Western states. Media coverage plays a significant role in shaping these disparities. Prominent Western media outlets consistently spotlight abuses by rival powers such as Russia or China, keeping these narratives in the public eye. Meanwhile, human rights violations in Western nations receive comparatively less attention, or are often framed as systemic but unintentional rather than deliberate. This reporting bias shapes public opinion and influences which issues receive priority at global institutions like the UN Human Rights Council or the European Court of Human Rights. These inconsistencies are also evident in refugee and asylum processes. A stark contrast can be observed between the EU's welcoming stance towards Ukrainian refugees and its treatment of arrivals from the Middle East or Africa. After Russia's February 2022 invasion of Ukraine, the EU activated its rarely used Temporary Protection Directive, allowing approximately 8 million Ukrainians to work immediately, access education and healthcare, and move freely within member states. This approach marked a significant departure from the complex and prolonged processes faced by Syrians, Afghans, Somalis, and others in earlier crises. For example, during the 2015 refugee crisis, many European countries erected physical barriers, conducted pushbacks at sea, and entered into controversial agreements, such as the EU-Turkey deal, to reduce migrant flows from the Middle East and North Africa. As a result, numerous refugees were confined to overcrowded facilities in places like Lesbos or transit countries such as Libya and Turkey, where they faced limited aid and frequent rights violations. Critics argue that the comparatively favorable treatment of Ukrainians underscores ingrained ethnic, cultural, and religious biases. Ukrainians, being predominantly white, Christian, and European, are seen as more familiar, whereas Syrians, Afghans, or Somalis, often Muslim, non-European in language, and influenced by different traditions, face greater suspicion, prejudice, and bureaucratic hurdles. Research from organizations like the Refugee Council and the European Council on Refugees and Exiles, ECRI, highlights discrimination against non-European asylum seekers, including slower processing times, lower acceptance rates, and restricted access to education or employment opportunities. European officials defending these policies often cite the directness of Russian aggression, geographical proximity, and logistical feasibility as reasons for the rapid response to Ukrainian refugees. However, critics counter that no similar urgency was shown for Syrians fleeing Aleppo's destruction, Afghans escaping the Taliban, or Somalis trapped in prolonged crises. Studies from the European Parliament reveal that emergency measures granted to Ukrainians were not extended during previous humanitarian emergencies, exposing a pattern of selectivity. Europe's dual-tier refugee system contradicts its proclaimed ideals of equality and universal human rights. By offering favorable terms to certain groups while imposing restrictions on others, the EU signals that cultural or religious similarities often outweigh consistent humanitarian principles. With ongoing conflicts, climate change, and economic pressures driving migration from the global south, these inconsistencies are likely to fuel further debate, urging Europe and the global community to align their humanitarian principles with equitable application. At the International Monetary Fund, IMF, voting quotas determine financial resources and influence, and despite updates, the United States and EU hold over half of the voting power. In the early 2020s, Western-aligned countries retained more than 60% of the IMF's voting power, giving them significant control over policies, loan conditions, and planning. The United States alone holds over 16%, effectively granting it veto power over measures requiring an 85% supermajority. Meanwhile, China, whose GDP surpassed $18 trillion by 2020, holds less than 7% of the voting power, a significant mismatch with its economic size. This entrenched imbalance has prompted Brics nations to push for reforms, advocating for revised quotas that better reflect shifting global economic dynamics. Initiatives like the New Development Bank, launched by Brics in 2014, offer alternative financing aligned with the priorities of emerging economies. These efforts highlight the slow progress of traditional international financial institutions in incorporating new power centers. Some Western officials acknowledge that a more equitable governance model could enhance the IMF's and World Bank's credibility and effectiveness. However, political barriers and institutional inertia continue to obstruct significant change. Without reform, critics warn, these institutions risk losing relevance in an increasingly multipolar world. Global power struggles exacerbate grievances about inequities. Russia, sidelined by sanctions after its 2022 invasion of Ukraine, has deepened its reliance on Brics for economic and diplomatic collaboration. Similarly, China's positions on Hong Kong, Xinjiang, and the South China Sea have underscored collective efforts within Brics to challenge what they perceive as Western dominance in areas such as international oversight, trade, and climate policy. Brics nations argue that Western-led climate strategies impose disproportionate burdens on industrializing countries. For instance, India advocates for fair climate action that includes financial and technological assistance. Similarly, US and EU agricultural subsidies are a source of contention, as they provide advantages to Western producers while widening global inequalities. To address these long-standing imbalances, various proposals have gained traction. Expanding the UN Security Council to include permanent seats for rising powers such as India and Brazil would better reflect current geopolitical realities. Strengthening regional blocs like the African Union or Mercosur could help distribute influence more evenly. Additionally, the emergence of new coalitions like Brics Plus, potentially including nations such as Saudi Arabia and Egypt, signals a shift toward greater non-Western influence. As Brics broadens its reach, demands for systemic reform grow louder. Should Western nations resist significant changes, Brics and its allies may develop parallel frameworks to counterbalance the Western-led order. While internal disagreements exist within Brics, the future of global governance may hinge on their ability to unite behind a coherent vision for a more inclusive international system. The United Nations, founded after World War II, was designed to promote peace, security, and cooperation in a world recovering from conflict and colonial exploitation. While it has achieved notable successes, its structure and decision-making processes are increasingly criticized as outdated and ill-suited to the complexities of the 21st century. The UN's hierarchical structure, particularly in the Security Council, grants disproportionate power to the 5 permanent members: the United States, Russia, China, France, and the United Kingdom. This arrangement reflects a post-war power dynamic that marginalizes the voices of the Global South, which includes many emerging economies and nations with significant stakes in global issues. Contemporary issues such as climate change, cyber threats, pandemics, and economic inequality require inclusive and adaptive multilateral approaches. However, the UN often struggles to act decisively due to entrenched bureaucracy and the disproportionate influence of a few powerful states. Reforms could include restructuring key bodies like the Security Council to increase permanent membership and reduce veto power, empowering the General Assembly, and ensuring fair funding mechanisms that do not overburden developing nations. Strengthening the participation of underrepresented regions would enhance the UN's credibility and foster greater cooperation in addressing global challenges. Without meaningful reform, dissatisfaction and disengagement among excluded nations are likely to grow. To remain relevant, the UN must evolve from a relic of post-war and colonial hierarchies into a dynamic institution that embodies equality, justice, and collective action. Only by adopting these changes can it achieve its founding vision and serve as a cornerstone of international peace and progress. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video or found it insightful, please consider supporting us by liking and subscribing. Your engagement helps us grow and reach a broader audience. Check out another video on our channel, now on the screen.